A little over a week ago, Nintendo celebrated the fact that Gary Bowser had been sentenced by the federal government to 3 years in prison and fined $14.5 million. They thanked the federal government and they did a whole PR release about it, even though apparently Gary Bowser allegedly just ran the websites and had very little to do with the hacking itself, was paid very little, was actually quite poor, living in a small apartment, and the company that he was working for that was making these hacks and making millions of dollars, he was only making $500 to $1,000 a month. So yeah, they celebrated a poor guy going to prison. And what was he going to prison for? Not a violent crime, not anything that really affected anybody. I don't really think it affected Nintendo's bottom line in any way. And I understand that there are a lot of people that are going to be against modern piracy. They say that it really does affect the bottom line of video game companies, but if we look at the profitability of Nintendo, I feel like that seems a bit overkill. And Nintendo's known for being overkill about this. They've gone after so many different ROM websites. Now, I would argue what he did and his group did was a lot worse than what emulator sites do, because you could argue that emulator sites are the only way to play a lot of these old games. You can't just go out and buy a brand new GameCube game that supports Nintendo. You can't do it. You can buy a used game, but that's not helping Nintendo anyway, so why do they care? And that's the thing. We want game preservation, and Nintendo doesn't care. Nintendo doesn't care about preservation. They only care about what's profitable right now. I don't know if they think that old games are going to hinder modern game sales. I would argue they do the opposite, because you get to play the older parts of the series, because Nintendo's been making the same series since the dawn of their original consoles. I mean, you go back, you want to play the old Mario games, and then you're going to play the new ones, or maybe you try an old one and now you want to play the new ones. I would argue that they're not hurting the sales of modern games, and they're not hurting their bottom line. So the fact that, again, they're going after emulation, they're going after ways of playing these old games, when just this week, they announced that they are shutting down the Wii U eShop and the 3DS eShop, once again proving that they don't care about preservation. Because guess what? Where else are you going to get these games? There are a lot of these games on these platforms that you can't play on any other platform. There are a lot of games that have not left those specific shops and are digital only. They never had a physical release, so the only way to play them was on those eShops, or through pirating, which they just celebrated taking down somebody who contributed to pirating. And yet, for a lot of people, this is going to be the only way they're going to be able to play these Wii U and 3DS games. Now, it's inevitable that these shops are gonna go down at some point. But it's kind of strange with the 3DS, considering they sold, 70 million of these systems? I mean, 70 million consoles out there, and you're telling me nobody's buying anything on the eShop right now? And the fact that they're limiting the opportunity of people buying these games is also very strange. Now, a lot of people are gonna say, you've had all this time. You've had all this time to buy these games. It doesn't matter. I don't find that to be true. You've had all this time to buy these games. Maybe you didn't know about a certain game. Maybe you're online and you see a YouTube video and you're like, oh, that game looks like a lot of fun. I want to go and buy it, and you can't now. And yet, you want to emulate it, and yet Nintendo's going after those too. And yet, Nintendo wouldn't make any money because they won't be able to sell it anymore because they're not going to have an eShop. And it's so backwards and frustrating how Nintendo works. Because if you bought an Xbox 360 game on your 360, you can play it on your Xbox Series X. If you bought a PlayStation 4 game, you can play it on your PlayStation 5. Yeah, it sucks. You can't play a lot of PS3 games. They haven't carried a lot of that over. PlayStation's a little bit behind as well. Maybe this is just a Japanese company thing. I don't quite know why backwards compatibility was so unimportant to them. But, I mean, you can play original Xbox games. Not all of them, but you can play some original Xbox games on your Xbox Series X. Whereas the Nintendo Switch, you can play Nintendo Switch games. And yeah, they've put, some games from the NES, some games from the Super Nintendo, and very poorly brought over N64 games, but they haven't brought over that virtual console. They haven't brought over all of those games that you could buy on the Wii U. And for a lot of these games, they weren't using that little touch screen anyway, the little controller, to its fullest. So it's strange that they can't just bring them over. You can never just bring things over that you've purchased in the past from Nintendo. Everything you've bought digitally from Nintendo is just worthless. They don't care about game preservation, and they've made that clear, which makes this all the more frustrating. And the thing is a lot of people are going to start saying, but yeah, now we know, and now you have a year. You don't have a year. You don't have until they shut down the eShop to buy all these games, because they're not allowing to use your credit card after May of this year. So even though you have until 2023, you actually only have until May of this year to use a credit card on the eShop. That's another backwards idea here. I don't understand why they give you such a limited amount of time to use your credit card on the eShop. I don't understand why that would be so difficult to wait until the very last day to allow people to use credit cards. It's simply another decision that is just a Nintendo decision. They seem to focus on things that don't make any sense. They don't re-release games that people are begging for. And now, another thing that's going to happen with the eShop going down on both of these platforms is the secondary market is going to run wild. We are already seeing games go for crazy amounts of money. Crazy amounts of money. What is it, like $70, $80 for Twilight Princess HD? And now it's just going to be even worse because there's not going to be a way to digitally buy them. You're going to have zero way to actually legitimately buy these games anymore unless you're buying them on the secondhand market for an insane markup, which again, Nintendo is not seeing any profit from, and again brings up the question as to why they are shutting down this eShop to begin with. I would argue that if they're not planning on bringing any of these games to the future platforms, and they're not going to give you a way to play it, they need to stop going after emulation websites. People want to experience a lot of these games, and the only way is going to be through piracy now, or emulation. And yet Nintendo is going to continue to be strict about it. They're going to continue to go after people that decide to want to play old games, even though they're not profiting from it in any way, shape, or form. And they're not losing any money because, again, you can't buy it anywhere. And it, again, just makes Nintendo look terrible. If Nintendo wants to profit off these games, bring back the Virtual Console. Bring back all of those old games that you were selling on the Wii U. And hell, I mean, I'm sure they could find a way to put a lot of these 3DS games on the Switch. And in this way, everybody would win. Nintendo would look great because they're not constantly going after people. And they would look great because they do care about game preservation. And they're putting all of their old titles on their current console, which is also making them money. And although the Nintendo Switch is one of the fastest selling consoles of all time, I feel like it would sell even faster if you could go back and play old Wii U, GameCube, N64, and just all of the different classics that were on those older systems that Nintendo owned and has the rights to. This trickle-fed system that we're getting on the Nintendo Online expansion pack and just the regular Nintendo Online is just not cutting it. Especially when they can't even emulate or port their own games correctly. So it sucks for so many more reasons than people think that they're shutting down these eShops. Not only are we not going to have access to those games anymore, Nintendo is going to continue to make it difficult to play these by shutting down emulation and ROM websites, and they're also never going to put these things on the Switch. It's been, 4 or 5 years already, and they haven't done it yet? And if they were, you think they would announce that sort of thing while they're shutting down those eShops. And, of course, that cherry on top, the fact that the secondary market is going to explode more than it already has. So while the value of my 3DS and Wii U collection is going to continue to skyrocket, everybody else who wants to experience these games for the first time, they're just not going to be able to for a decent price. Let me know how you guys feel about this down in the comments below. Of course, like the video if you guys liked it, subscribe for more content, and as always, have a fantastic day. See you, everybody.